So I was reading an article by Thor Serling last week that basically said life as we know it is ending. Well, not ending so much, but the idea was that the human world basically evolved in a C4 environment, but with the current climate change, we might be spiraling out of that C4 world more quickly than we came into it.
Right, so how did these researchers come to that conclusion, and what does it even mean to be in a C4 world? How can our C whatever world change?
I had some of the same questions. I'm wondering what it is exactly that makes researchers concerned about modern climate change trends and how we can examine the past for help in looking into the future. This week, we look into the Miocene grassland expansion to determine how life on Earth may change for good.
To dissect this issue, we spoke with groups of scientists around the world that are asking the same questions we are.
This question led me to my first stop this week, the Eastern Mediterranean region, where researchers Kirschner, Kovacic, and Dilcher are examining phytolith studies to glean information on the formation of grass-dominated habitats. Now, by examining these phytoliths, which are fossilized plant tissues, the scientists are determining that the Earth began to hold lots of grass-dominated habitats by the early Miocene, a period which began around 23 million years ago. Before the Miocene, many habitats contained a wider variety of vegetation, such as trees and other brush. Kirschner and his team are asserting that the transition from diverse vegetation to open grass came as a result of a depletion in atmospheric CO2. According to data from leaf-based CO2 reconstructions, atmospheric carbon dioxide fell dramatically between the Miocene and the Oligocene, the period which came immediately before it.
How are researchers determining so much about past atmospheric CO2 levels? How do they even have an idea of what CO2 levels used to look like?
Actually, it was another team of researchers, Pearson and Palmer, that showed me the ropes for the CO2 data. I went to visit them at one of their research sites in the tropical Pacific, where they're using ancient planktonic foraminifera shells at the bottom of the ocean to estimate the atmospheric carbon levels at different stages in the Earth's history. Pearson and Palmer are deconstructing around 60 million years of carbon concentrations by measuring the boron isotope ratios in these shells, and they're using that data to estimate the pH of the ocean water at different periods in the geologic timescale. So with this data, they've determined that the atmosphere was very carbon dense during the late Paleocene and early Eocene periods, with levels reaching around 2,000 parts per million about 60 to 52 million years ago. However, after this period, atmospheric carbon went into a serious decline. They told me that since the beginning of the Miocene, around 23 million years ago, atmospheric carbon levels have remained at a much lower level, below 500 parts per million. Basically, they're proving that there was, in fact, a large-scale decline in atmospheric CO2 right around the time that Kirschner's team is saying that grasses began to outcompete with other types of vegetation.
Okay, but why did grasses fare better than other vegetation in this low-carbon world?
Well, that question's a little bit more complex. To answer it, I've brought in researcher Catherine Freeman, who can break down these plants in a bit more detail. Dr. Freeman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Help us out here. What makes grasses so special?
Well, to put it simply, grasses are better at adapting to low-carbon environments because of their capacity for C4 carbon fixation. So there are some plants, C3 plants, that fix carbon in a way that leaves the plant susceptible to carbon loss through photorespiration. Generally, trees and shrubs fix carbon in that way, and it's very efficient. But if there is not a lot of atmospheric carbon, plants can't afford to lose carbon through respiration at the rates that C3 plants do. So C4 plants overcome this obstacle by fixing carbon in a new way. Basically, they add a few more steps to the carbon fixation process and lock away the carbon atoms deeper within their cells so that it cannot escape through respiration. These extra steps take more energy from the plant, but they help out a lot with reducing carbon loss. So in C4 plants like the grasses you're seeing in the Miocene, that difference is what makes them more efficient in a low-carbon world.
So it makes sense that a low-carbon Earth would cause C3 plants to die out, while C4 plants would thrive and expand. That's why we're in a C4 world, because it's a low-carbon world?
Well, not quite. It's actually pretty unlikely that a low-carbon atmosphere directly caused the expansion of C4 grasslands. Our research actually found that the drop in atmospheric CO2 occurred a full 15 million years before the grasslands started to expand. So it's more likely that the drop in CO2 started a chain of events that later aided the expansion of C4 grasslands.
Well, Dr. Freeman, you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you. Up next, Tim will discuss his findings. Don't go anywhere.
So, with all that information, I decided to head over to speak with Dr. Catherine Badgley, who agreed to meet with me at the University of Michigan. Now, her and her team are primarily interested in examining and interpreting ecological diversity. In one particular study, they looked at isotopic records for 27 different mammals in combination with tooth structure data. Her team concluded that there were only two possibilities for response to this massive change to a C4 world: altered dietary habits or extinction. They really emphasized how climate change impacts plant life and the vegetation structure, which in turn devastates mammalian diversity. As vegetation habits shrink or expand, herbivores shift their geographic ranges to remain in a particular habitat.
So what does this mean? Does it really tell us why C4 grass expansion was important?
Well, what she said shows how climate change really can change all types of life on Earth.
I guess the big question is if climate changes in the future are going to have as large of an impact.
Alright, so later that week I headed over to Pakistan to meet with Dr. Sterling and his team that were collecting fossil soil samples called paleosoil from the area. They were comparing the carbon isotopes from the carbonate in the soil to the levels in fossil tooth enamel from North American horses. His team really tried to get to the bottom of CO2 level fluctuations that correlated with the expansion of C4 grasses. They drew the conclusion that the gross expansion of C4 biomass on the landscapes was caused by low atmospheric CO2 levels. This made C4 plants more successful than C3 plants because, as you talked about with Dr. Freeman, C4 photosynthesis is optimal when CO2 levels are low.
So this is more of the same thing. A spike in CO2 caused the expansion of grasslands.
Yeah, really, it offers more evidence supporting the massive role CO2 plays in shaping life on Earth.
Do you have anything else?
I was actually able to speak with Dr. Sterling again, and he highlighted a study from 1993 where he compared 8 million year old fossil teeth samples to teeth samples that are only 6 million years old. The 8 million year old teeth showed that the ancient animals had diets compatible with a C3 dominated or even pure C3 diet. However, the more recent teeth from 6 million years ago showed that the mammals had a C4 dominated diet during that time. These changes in diet correlate with changes in atmospheric CO2 levels, so we reinforced his and others' claim that CO2 levels drove C4 expansion over many continents at the same time.
Right, great. More CO2. Everyone but Catherine Freeman and her team seems to agree that CO2 was the driving force of the C4 expansion, and even they admit that higher atmospheric CO2 levels played a major role.
Things were finally starting to make sense and things were adding up, and we had all this evidence from different studies done by different people that all seemed to pretty much agree. But then we met with Dr. Erica Edwards, and here's what she had to say about the issue.
A grievance my team and I had with many of the studies published is that they failed to take into account grass evolutionary biology and grassland ecosystem sciences. I recognize that there was a C4 grassland expansion in the Miocene. However, I think it is irresponsible to conclude that decreasing levels of CO2 was driving the C4 dominance. The oldest C4 grass fossil is from the Middle Eocene, tens of millions of years before the Miocene expansion. There is even more evidence that C4 plants existed long before in the Cretaceous. In many regions, mammals were feeding primarily on C4 grasses more than 1 million years before these C4 grasses became abundant.
She continued to say that increasing seasonality in dry seasons, in conjunction with an overall increase in aridity for many regions, caused an increased amount of forest fires, and this is supported by charcoal records. So this, coupled with the presence of C4 plants on the landscape, is what may have caused their dominance. They only took advantage of the space that was cleared by fires.
Oh, so CO2 levels favoring C4 photosynthesis wasn't necessarily what drove the expansion.
Yeah, she even said that a lot of the time when C3 photosynthesis is compared to C4 photosynthesis, the plants looked at are far too different and the species diverged from one another long ago, so that the photosynthesis processes are just one of many qualities that are different between the plants being compared.
What does all of this mean? Why should we really care? These are still questions that we are trying to piece together. There's a lot of data, from soil samples to tooth enamel, proving that CO2 increased during the Miocene grassland expansion, but can we really say that this drove the expansion? Edwards and Freeman both think we can't.
So, can we really say that an increase in CO2 would send us back into a C3 world? All we really know is that life on Earth relies on C4 vegetation, and that this vegetation may change as the climate changes.
Is our industrial society putting us at risk for ending the C4 world as we know it?